It started with a storm. Not a huge one, just a regular rain that left the streets glistening and the grass soaked. But when I stepped outside, I realized something was very wrong. My backyard, usually dry and safe, had puddles forming in places that had never held water before. And then I saw it. The water wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from my neighbor's land, redirected in a way that sent their rain straight onto mine. Boards were soggy, flower beds drowning, and the small garden I had worked on for months was beginning to look like a swamp. My first reaction was disbelief. They actually did this. I muttered, pacing the yard. I could see the culprits across the way, casually inspecting their own driveway, as if nothing had happened. That's when the simmering anger hit. They weren't just careless, they were deliberate. And that's when I knew I couldn't just wait for them to notice or rely on the HOA to do anything. I needed a plan, and it needed to be clever. I spent the morning measuring the slope of my yard, tracing the paths where the water flowed, and imagining ways to redirect it back, or at least to make it inconvenient enough that they'd understand they had crossed a line. I wasn't trying to cause damage. I wanted them to experience a consequence that was safe but undeniable, something that would make them pause, think, and reconsider their behavior. It wasn't just the water, it was the principle. My property, my garden, my time and effort were being disrespected, and it was clear they had assumed there would be no consequences. That assumption had to be corrected, so I started mapping out a plan. I sketched the yard, noting where the water pooled, where it entered my property, and where I could build small channels or barriers that would redirect the flow in a controlled, strategic way. The idea wasn't just to defend my land. It was to send a message. While I was planning, my kids came outside, noticing my furrowed brow. "Dad, what's going on?" my youngest asked. I explained calmly. "Someone sent a little extra rain our way, and I'm going to fix it in a way they won't forget." Their eyes widened, half curious, half excited. I smiled, knowing that sometimes the best lessons are taught not with words, but with clever actions that speak louder than shouting ever could. I began collecting materials: rocks, temporary barriers, some sandbags, and a few small channels to guide the water. Every choice was deliberate. I didn't want to flood anyone's property. I just wanted to create a controlled situation where the water would remind them that actions have consequences. I marked the flow paths with stakes, measured the slope to ensure proper drainage, and even calculated where the water would be forced to pool temporarily so it would inconvenience them just enough to notice, but safely. Each step was like setting up a scene in a movie. I could picture Karen, the neighbor who had orchestrated this little water invasion, arriving home after the next rain and watching her clever redirection unfold. I imagined the confusion, the frown, the muttering under her breath. And I had to smile quietly. This was justice, not in anger, but in clever design and strategy. By the afternoon, I had dug small channels and placed barriers where necessary. I tested the flow with buckets of water, making adjustments as needed. Every test showed the water moving predictably, safely, and right where I wanted it. Back toward their property line, subtly but unmistakably. It was perfect. Not destructive, not dangerous, just a little inconvenient and completely undeniable. That evening, I documented everything. Photos of the channels, sketches of the barriers, notes about slopes and water paths. Not paranoia, preparation. If Karen or anyone else questioned the setup later, I would have clear evidence that the changes were functional, legal, and safe, while delivering the lesson exactly as intended. By the next morning, the storm came, and as I watched, water ran through the channels. Exactly as I had planned. My garden remained safe, my flowers unharmed, and the water redirected subtly but effectively toward the area that had previously caused my frustration. I stepped back and sipped my coffee, smiling quietly as I observed the result. Karen arrived shortly after, unaware of the subtle adjustments, and immediately noticed something was off. Her frown appeared the moment she stepped onto her driveway. She checked her yard, then glanced toward mine, and I could almost see the gears turning in her head. "Wait, what's happening here?" she muttered, tapping her phone, walking the perimeter, trying to figure out why the water wasn't flowing the way it used to. That moment, the pause, the confusion, the dawning realization, was exactly why I had taken the time to plan and measure everything carefully. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't spite. It was strategy. It was controlled, thoughtful, and clever. And as I watched her circle, muttering, I realized that this lesson would stick far longer than any angry confrontation or complaint ever could. Boundaries mattered. Property mattered. And respect came with consequences, cleverly executed. The next few days were all about execution. I wasn't just defending my yard. I was setting the stage for a subtle, undeniable lesson. I checked the channels and barriers I had installed after the first storm, making sure everything was solid and functional. Every channel, every sandbag, every small diversion had to be precise. Enough to redirect water safely, but enough to make Karen notice the change. I didn't want flooding, damage, or legal trouble, just a clever reversal of the problem she had caused. On the first real test day, rain clouds gathered overhead. I watched from the porch, coffee in hand, as the first drops began to fall. The water flowed into the channels exactly as I had predicted, traveling from her property into the diversion points I had created. My backyard remained dry, the garden untouched, and the flower beds safe. But over on her side, water began to collect where she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't dangerous, but it was noticeable, and it was a little inconvenient. Karen arrived soon after, umbrella in hand, and her face registered confusion immediately. She stepped out, looked at the puddles forming near her driveway, then glanced toward my property. I pretended to adjust a garden hose casually, leaning on the railing, taking a slow sip of coffee. Inside, I was quietly thrilled. This was the moment I had planned for. The dawning realization that actions, even subtle ones like rerouting water, have consequences. She circled her yard, stepping carefully to avoid the accumulating water, muttering under her breath. This isn't right, she said, tapping her phone. I waved politely, smiling. Beautiful day, isn't it? The irony wasn't lost on me. She had caused the problem, and now she was facing the result without any yelling, any confrontation, just a clever, inevitable consequence. Over the next several hours, I monitored the water flow. Every channel functioned perfectly. Rainwater that had once poured unchecked onto my property now followed a controlled, subtle path, occasionally pooling just enough to make her pause, check, and think. I wasn't doing anything illegal, unsafe, or malicious. It was all controlled, precise, and predictable. But the lesson was landing beautifully. Karen had to acknowledge the problem, understand the cause, and witness firsthand that her actions had consequences. I documented everything meticulously. Photos, timestamps, measurements of the channels and sandbag placements, notes about flow patterns. Not paranoia, just preparation. If she complained to anyone, HOA, city officials, neighbors, I could show the entire setup was legal, safe, and cleverly executed. And honestly, it was fun. Not in a malicious sense, but in a quiet, clever, satisfying way. Planning, patience, and strategy had created a result far more impactful than yelling or threats ever could. By midweek, Karen had tried a few attempts to fix the water flow herself. She repositioned hoses, dug small channels on her side, and even tried redirecting water with sandbags of her own. But my adjustments were subtle yet effective. The main channels I had built were secure and controlled, so her attempts were temporarily futile. I watched quietly from the porch, pretending to prune the hedges, while she struggled, confused, and muttering about why it's still flowing this way. The kids were fascinated. "Dad, look, she's trying to fix it," one whispered, giggling. I chuckled quietly, explaining that this wasn't about causing trouble. It was about teaching lessons through careful observation and clever action. And that's exactly what was happening. Karen was learning, slowly, methodically, and the lesson was sticking far better than any angry confrontation ever could have. As the storms continued over the next few days, the subtle inconvenience became consistent. Every time it rained, the flow followed the channels I had designed. Her yard experienced the consequences of the water rerouting she had initiated. My garden stayed safe. My flower beds remained untouched. And Karen? She learned boundaries, respect, and foresight without me ever raising my voice. It was almost poetic, justice delivered quietly, efficiently, and cleverly. One particularly heavy rain showed the full effect. Water that had once flooded my property now created tiny but noticeable puddles in her yard, near the edges of her driveway and pathways. She stepped out, staring at the situation, muttering, shaking her head, tapping her phone. It was perfect. She realized for the first time that her actions, something she had done casually, without thinking, had real, unavoidable consequences. I could see her making mental notes, reconsidering the next steps, and even showing subtle signs of respect. She didn't approach my property carelessly anymore. She walked around, assessed the situation, and paused before taking any action. And that, more than anything, was the result I had been aiming for. Not revenge, not destruction, just acknowledgement, respect, and awareness. Neighbors began noticing subtle changes too. Some stopped to comment on the ingenuity of the water management. Others whispered about the clever reversal of the flooding problem. Mrs. Patel waved across the street, smiling knowingly. "Looks like someone learned the hard way," she said. And I nodded, savoring the recognition without gloating. It was quiet, subtle, and perfectly executed justice. By the end of the week, Karen's attitude had shifted completely. She stopped making snide remarks, avoided crossing boundaries, and even nodded politely when we passed each other on the street. The lesson had landed. The consequence had been experienced, and I could finally relax, knowing that patience, planning, and careful execution had achieved something far more satisfying than confrontation or anger ever could have. Reflecting on it, I realized the key takeaways. Patience and preparation outperform immediate anger or confrontation. Knowledge and observation amplify effectiveness. Understanding water flow, property boundaries, and safety limits allowed for a clever, legal, and permanent solution. Subtle, controlled action often teaches lessons more effectively than any shouting or argument. Standing on the porch, watching the rain flow safely through the channels, I understood that cleverness and strategy often create victories that are quieter but far more lasting than any dramatic confrontation. Karen had learned her lesson. Boundaries were respected, and my property remained safe. All without a single angry word being exchanged. By the weekend, everything was in place. The channels, sandbags, and diversion points were all functioning perfectly. My yard remained safe and dry, while Karen's side of the property now had to deal with the consequences of her careless actions. Not dangerous, not destructive, just noticeable enough to make her think twice. I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the final rainwater flow through the channels I had built. It moved exactly where I had intended, controlled, subtle, and completely undeniable. Karen pulled into her driveway mid-afternoon, umbrella in hand. At first, she looked calm, confident, ready to go about her day. But then she froze. The water wasn't following the path she expected. Her brow furrowed, fingers tapping her phone, muttering under her breath. What's going on here?" she said aloud. I leaned casually against the railing, pretending to admire the garden, coffee in hand, while inside I felt that quiet thrill, the realization that the lesson was landing perfectly. Over the next few days, Karen's behavior shifted completely. She stopped trying to manipulate the water flow, avoided getting too close to the channels, and approached the area cautiously. She wasn't angry, not outwardly, but she was aware, cautious, and finally respecting the boundaries she had ignored. That was the point. I hadn't yelled, I hadn't threatened, I hadn't caused harm. And yet, she learned her lesson. I also noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. Mrs. Patel waved knowingly. Another neighbor paused to comment on the cleverness of the water redirection. Everyone could see that boundaries existed, and disrespecting them had consequences. I didn't have to say a word. The setup spoke for itself. Sometimes, the quiet, calculated action teaches more than confrontation ever could. The kids loved it. "Dad, look. The water goes where it's supposed to now," my youngest exclaimed. I smiled. "Exactly," I said. And someone had to learn that boundaries matter. It wasn't about revenge. It was about teaching lessons through clever, ethical, and controlled action. And seeing the lessons sink in without conflict was more satisfying than any dramatic showdown. Reflecting on the whole ordeal, I realized a few key takeaways that anyone dealing with boundary violations could benefit from. Patience is essential. Reacting immediately with anger or confrontation rarely produces lasting results. Knowledge and preparation matter. Understanding water flow, slope, and safe diversion methods made the solution effective and legal. Subtle, clever action teaches lessons better than shouting. The experience was memorable for Karen because it was undeniable, controlled, and permanent, but not destructive. Standing on the porch after the last storm, watching water flow safely and effectively, I understood that the true victory wasn't just the clever setup, It was the respect that came with it. Karen had learned. The neighborhood had witnessed boundaries being enforced intelligently, and my property remained safe. It was a quiet, controlled triumph, far more satisfying than confrontation or escalation could ever have been. And here's what I want viewers to think about. What would you do if a neighbor's actions started causing damage or inconvenience? Would you yell, call authorities, or escalate? Or could you find a clever, safe, and effective solution that teaches the lesson without conflict? Drop your stories in the comments. I want to hear how people handle situations where respect, boundaries, and property rights are ignored. Karen had changed. The water no longer flowed where she expected. Her yard now bore the consequences of her thoughtlessness, and she approached my property cautiously. That subtle shift in behavior was the exact outcome I had envisioned from the start. The lesson had landed. No shouting, no confrontation, just quiet, undeniable correction. By the end of the week, everything had stabilized. The channels were secure, the sandbags in place, and the flow perfectly controlled. My garden remained untouched, my flowers safe, and my family could enjoy the yard without worry. Karen's attitude had changed subtly but permanently. She recognized boundaries and consequences, which was more satisfying than any immediate revenge could have been. So here's the challenge for you. Viewers, think about your own boundaries, your property, and how you might respond if someone tried to violate them. Could you stay calm, plan carefully, and deliver a subtle but permanent lesson? Or would you react impulsively, risk escalation, and miss the opportunity for a clever solution? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Let's discuss clever, strategic, and fair ways to handle conflicts with neighbors. Because at the end of the day, the quiet, intelligent, calculated victories, the ones executed with patience, observation, and careful planning, are far more satisfying and lasting than any shouting match or immediate reaction. As I watched the rainwater move predictably through the channels, I knew this lesson would last for years, for my family, my neighbors, and anyone who might think boundaries are optional.